Hi, welcome to session 3 of the sixth topic of the semester, the American Revolution from 1776 to 1783. So this is session 3, and now we're going to be moving into the last segments, the last portions of this topic that is going to cover the coming and process now of the American independence movement, the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the revolutionary struggle, although we're not really going to be paying attention to military campaigns and battles or anything like that. We're just going to go over the most essential aspects of the American Revolution. And at the end, we're just going to look at the outcomes. Again, the end results, the outcomes, that is to say. Okay? All right, so now let's move again into the outline. And now we're moving into part 2. So part 1 we already covered quite fully, dealing with the origins, the causes of the American independence revolution. We examined the economic factors, the economic causes, dealing with the Navigation Acts. So we cover that quite extensively. You know, the laws of trade. Great Britain is attempting to monitor, to supervise the trade with her colonies in order to make sure that the colonies were sending the products that the colonies produced directly to England. Again, so those reforms or those laws of trade were known as the Navigation Acts. Again, so we examined that quite thoroughly, you know, ever since the 1600s, the British attempting to regulate the tobacco and sugar trade. And after the end of the French and Indian War, the British, because they were in debt, were attempting to extract revenues from her colonies in order to pay for this very large debt they ended up with, fighting the French and the Indians that were allied with the French, you know, the French and Indian alliance in North America for 7 years. So they acquired a large debt that they needed to repay, and so they believed that one way to do it is to tax the colonies on the trade, particularly. So again, so we looked at all that quite thoroughly, and we also were looking at the ideological origins of the revolution as well, the ideas of the revolution. There was a series of ideas, again, new political philosophies that were written by Europeans, particularly in the 1700s, during the Enlightenment period. Again, the century of the Enlightenment in Europe. It was a century of unprecedented scientific, philosophical, intellectual growth, new scientific ideas, you know, about how the world worked. You know, the new science, the modern science was born during this time, and also all of the ideas, all of the political ideas of the future as well were written during this time. Political representation, popular sovereignty, what the ideas of democracy, for example, that we're so familiar with, the ideas of natural rights philosophy, life, liberty, and property, elections, and the like. All of those ideas that we're so familiar, so accustomed today in the modern world, societies that live under democratic systems. All of those ideas were written, again, during the 1700s, and the leaders of the colonies, the planters, the merchants, lawyers, shopkeepers, the educated class is going to actually read upon those ideas and receive inspiration. There's going to be great inspiration to actually think about the possibility of creating a new state. Again, that inspired them to actually take action and declare independence, because they felt that the ideas that they were reading about, you know, from John Locke, the ideas of life, liberty, and property, for example, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the social contract, the ideal state is one in which there's a contract, a covenant between the rulers and the ruled, you know, the government and the governed. in which the people are actually provided representation in the state whenever decisions need to be made, laws of trade or taxes and the like, that the people are going to be taken into account. That is to say, okay, their interests are going to be taken into account. They're going to have representation in a branch of government, whether it was a Congress or a parliament, and that people will also consent to the governed and in terms of choosing, again, their representatives through elections. Again, that there will be a process of elections by which the people are going to be choosing their representatives every 2 years or 4 years, etc. That there's going to be a system of elections again. That's the covenant. That is the ideal state. That there's a pact to keep a community going, to keep the society again in harmony. And that is, again, the agreement, again, that Jean-Jacques Rousseau in The Social Contract is writing about. So, of course, that provided inspiration, to the leaders of the colonies that they could indeed create the possibility, again, of this ideal state as well. And they also felt that this had to be created because they thought that those ideas were, really describing how human societies needed to be governed as well. In other words, they wanted representation in the British system. They believed that they really wanted to be represented in the British Parliament. They believed in political representation as well. So they were demanding rights, in other words, that they believed that they had certain rights and their interests needed to be taken into account. That the interest of the colonies needed to be taken into account. The voice, the opinions, again, of the colonists needed to be taken into account in the British Parliament whenever British Parliament needed to enact a law, for example. So again, all of the ideas of the Enlightenment, of these political philosophers that we described in session 2, are going to have a great influence, again, in the way the colonists are going to be thinking about politics, in other words, that they want reform, they want changes to take place in the political system in order for the colonies to participate in the process again as well, to have representation, in other words. If they're going to be paying tax as well, we want to send representatives, delegates to the British Parliament in London to represent our interests. So we want representation. So again, this is very important. We cover that, quite thoroughly in session 2. Now let's move into the next segment here, looking at the coming and process of the American Independence Revolution. And again, we're going to see now things moving faster towards independence, because as I just mentioned a moment ago, colonial leaders, merchants, particularly the merchant class, again, feel that they're to pay all of those taxes, that their trade is now restricted, that they cannot trade freely with outside merchants. Now they have to trade with the British exclusively, and they have to buy the products at the prices dictated by the British in many cases. And because the Currency Act, again, we discussed the Currency Act of 1764, indicates that now the colonies must pay with gold and silver all of the products that they want to import. Again, so if there's a colonial merchant, let's say in Boston, who wants to import black tea, that merchant will have to buy the tea from a British company, the East India Company, at the prices dictated by the company, but the company is going to charge gold and silver. Again, so the merchants in the colonies do not have gold and silver, so that means they're not going to be able to buy those products. So now the British East India Company is going to now sell the tea inside of the colonies. In other words, they're going to displace the merchants altogether. So it's not just that they're restricted from trading freely with non-British companies, but in many cases, they're not going to be able to actually engage in commerce as well. because of the navigation acts like the Currency Act, for example. Okay, so we're now going to look at now things moving quicker, much faster towards the moment of independence, the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and the struggle for independence as well. Okay, this is part 2. And as I mentioned, so what initially, again, colonial leaders demand is representation. Okay, so they're now experiencing waves and waves of laws emanating from the British Parliament regarding trade regulation with the colonies, like the Sugar Act, for example, the Stamp Act, the Currency Act, the Quartering Act, okay? And so far, what the colonial merchants, planters, the commercial elite, if you will, of the colonies, what they demand is that, well, if we are to obey those laws and pay those taxes, etc., so we want representation. In other words, we want political representation. So initially, they were just sending letters to the members of Parliament. The colonists were sending letters, notes of protest in many cases, complaints, and so on, indicating that the colonies require, again, British Parliament to welcome delegates from those 13 colonies. In other words, the colonies want to send a delegation, delegates to London, so they can sit again in the British Parliament to take a vote. So whenever British Parliament is about to enact a law or a tax on the colonies, then those delegates from the colonies can actually raise their hand and voice their opinion and, oversee, if you will, the interest of the colonies. Again, so it's political representation. Okay, so this is not, once again, something unknown for the British. We talked about the English Civil War, again, in session 2. The English went through this process already. Again, in the 1640s, they fought their king, Charles I. The merchants, that is to say, they waged war against the king in the English Civil War, precisely because the king was not providing political representation to the merchants, and he was just taxing the merchants, etc., seizing their property and so on. So, of course, this comes from within English history, this idea of political representation. This is not an alien or foreign concept that the colonists are just simply demanding the British to do, but rather this is consistent with English tradition now. The British Parliament was actually created out of a struggle, between the English merchants and the English king. And ultimately, the merchants won, the English Civil War again, and pretty much established a parliamentary system of government that they control, of course. So again, the colonists are very well aware of English history. They're very well aware of the English Civil War, and they're simply demanding, again, that if, again, we are, of course, English subjects, they said. We are subjects of the English king, we're subjects of England. So as subjects, yeah, we're going to pay those taxes, but we want representation. So they're demanding representation, but the British Parliament, okay, is not going to grant representation, okay? It's not going to create new seats in Parliament to welcome delegates coming from the colonies, okay? The British Parliament, okay, decided in 1766 to resolve this issue, okay, the issue of representation once and for all, by passing an act called the Declaratory Act. So British Parliament is actually responding to those letters. In other words, look, we're going to respond to you. We have a final answer, whether we're going to provide representation or not. So what the Declaratory Act said is that, look, we're not going to grant representation, okay, to you. We're not going to welcome delegates coming from the colonies because the British Parliament is simply going to oversee your interest from afar. Okay, we're here granting you what is called virtual representation. Virtual representation is that we're representing your interest in spirit. Okay, so in goodwill, we're just simply going to, again, represent your interest. There's no need for you to send delegates over here. We understand your problems. We understand your concerns. In fact, we're going to remove some of the taxes, some of the laws that we passed, some of them, not all of them, but we're going to, remove some of them, but there will be no real representation. In other words, you're not going to send people over to London, okay? There's not, again, the need for that because we're actually going to grant you virtual representation, which is just, again, saying, okay, so we're not going to grant you representation, but we're going to take you into account. We're going to actually take you into account and oversee your interests from afar and understand your problems. In other words, we're not just going to tax you just like that, but because, we're not going to ignore you. We understand your problems, etc. It's just virtual representation. So again, this created really one of the first debates or the first frictions between the colonies and Parliament. The issue of representation, the colonies want real representation, real. In other words, we're going to send people over, delegates, to Parliament, but Parliament in the Declaratory Act is just granting virtual representation, and it's just removing some of our taxes. But the most important thing, what the Declaratory Act said is that, look, even though we're going to remove some of those taxes, okay, please understand that the supreme authority of the colonies is the British Parliament. This is a declaration of authority, in other words. We might remove some taxes, okay, we're willing to negotiate with you, but we are, the official, authority of the land in North America, okay, the British Parliament. It's a declaration of authority. So even though some of those taxes got removed, they're actually telling you, okay, that that the British Parliament is actually the government of the colonies. In other words, okay. So so the colonies must acknowledge that fact. Okay, that in other words, you're not just going to go by your own rules. You're not just in North America, governing yourselves. You are going to be now following the laws emanating from Parliament, because Parliament is the supreme authority, again, of the colonies. It's a declaration of authority on March of 1776. So again, this is really not solving the problem. It's actually exacerbating the problem. The Declaratory Act, it was intending to soothe tensions, but in reality, it did not soothe the tensions. It did not please the colonists. In other words, the merchants were not pleased with that declaration, because what that implied is that in the future, if the British Parliament simply wants to continue enacting taxes on the colonies, they can do so, because they just declare that they are the government, again, of the colony, the supreme authority, and that we're not going to have a vote. We're not going to take a vote. We're not going to send a delegation to the British Parliament. And indeed, that's exactly what happened in 1767. Just the following year, British Parliament passed another series of taxes, to the colonies. So, again, it's mind-boggling, because, back to back, the next year, British Parliament just needs more revenues. And they said, look, we're actually going to enact more taxes, and we're going to choose other products that the colonies have to import, and they're going to have to be taxed, again, at the point of entry as well. Okay, and those are paper, glass, paint, lead, and black tea. And I put, again, letters there, tea there, because this is a very popular consumer product in the colonies. There's a great demand for it, and this is something that is sold every day. This is something widely consumed. So this product, again, has become so essential, in people's lives. People have to wake up with a cup of tea. It was the kind of coffee, for them, the way we use coffee today. We wake up with a cup of, coffee just because, it has caffeine. We wake up and we do work, etc. We're very productive because of it. So likewise, the colonies were using tea in that fashion as well. So again, the Townshend duties, they were called, the Townshend duties of 1767, are going to be now new taxes, taxes on products that were popular, widely consumed, and necessary in the colonies. And now the British are trying to extract revenues as well from those, again, imports, if you will, import duties, if you will. Okay, so again, this is really going to just simply escalate the tensions, as we'll see year by year. From this point onwards, the colonies are going to be now moving closer and closer, slowly but surely, again, to the point of independence itself. Okay, so the merchants themselves were the ones that are going to start really organizing the resistance, if you will, against the Navigation Acts. Okay, so they're the ones that are the most affected, by those acts, by those Navigation Acts. Like I mentioned, they're affected because either they're displaced completely from that activity, from that trade, or they have to pay simply higher taxes just to import those products. So they're affected directly. Okay, so the merchant class, okay, in the colonies are going to be the ones that are beginning to organize the revolts or the resistance against the Navigation Acts. And this is going to be more so in one colony. This is not to say that merchants outside of Massachusetts are not going to, do the same, but in Massachusetts, the merchants from Massachusetts colony were the most active, the most organized, in other words. And they're going to be rallying, of course, the masses against the Navigation Acts, and they're going to create a series of actions that are going to be affecting British interest in the colonies, of course. So now we see the beginning of a boiling point of tensions, in other words. This is not just a passive resistance anymore. We're getting to the point of a more active resistance, okay? And it's Massachusetts that is going to lead the way. They initiate the colonial revolts, and what we're going to see is that merchants, along with lawyers and shopkeepers, those that were really involved, again, in commerce, directly or indirectly, are going to start forming an association, again, a club, if you will, okay, that are going to be the leaders of the resistance movement, and they're going to go by the name of the Sons of Liberty. Again, in Massachusetts, this is the name that they went by. Again, this club, if you will, okay, this association, the Sons of Liberty. And of course, they're kind of presenting themselves in a very similar fashion as the merchants of England, the English merchants who fought the English king, King Charles I. Again, there is a tradition in England, again, that in the English Civil War, there was a rallying cry for liberty, again, that the merchants rally the masses, again, against the King of England, King Charles I, because he was depriving people of their liberty, he was depriving merchants of their property, and so on. And so they're very well aware of that past, and they're going to actually invoke that past, that English past. They're going to invoke it again in Massachusetts. And so they're going by the name of the Sons of Liberty. It just kind of remind people, again, that this is a tradition going back to the English Civil War. One of the three leaders, again, will be, there were numerous, of course, individuals there. But the leaders of the Sons of Liberty were James Otis, John Adams. John Adams will become eventually the second President of the United States, by the way. So we see the early, the early rise, if you will, of John Adams in the scene, and he's going to be one of the forerunners of the independence movement in Massachusetts, and Sam Adams as well. They were very active in rallying people to the cause of independence, but initially what they were actually doing is simply rallying the masses against the Navigation Acts. Not just, again, at this point we're not really talking about independence, but rather it was just creating a resistance against the Navigation Acts. Sam Adams was well known for going to the taverns, the pubs, what we call a bar today, okay, in Boston, and he will go there and actually read out loud or do speeches there, you know, to the people that were drinking there, political speeches in which he was going to talk about John Locke, you know, life, liberty, and property, the social contract, all of the ideas that I just discussed in the previous session. So again, he was very active again in doing that. Sam Adams, of course. So what they're going to be doing again in Massachusetts, the Sons of Liberty, the resistance actions of resistance is, for example, engage in pamphleteering. Okay, pamphleteering is simply the action of writing, okay, an essay in a pamphlet, and there's a booklet. That's what a pamphlet is. It's a small booklet. People will write a political commentary on some issue, let's say Navigation Acts, for example, the Stamp Act, you know, or just write a commentary on the ideas of John Locke, on the revolutionary ideas, of course, of England, you know, going back to the English Civil War, life, liberty, property, natural rights, and all that. Again, revolutionary ideas. They will print those pamphlets in numerous copies, pass them around. Some people will be reading those ideas out loud in front of large crowds. Because remember, I mean, at this point in the colonies, the literacy level, of course, was very low. Okay, it is estimated that it's about 20% of the colonies were literate. In other words, about 20%. So in many cases, the educated class in the colonies had to explain those ideas to the masses in speeches, for example, to read those ideas out loud or in public spaces, again, to large crowds. So this is one, again, of those resistance actions. Okay, the other resistance actions of the Sons of Liberty was really creating what is called a boycott. Okay, rallying the masses to boycott British companies like the East India Company, for example. What they were actually promoting here is the idea that, you know, don't buy products from Great Britain. Okay, don't import products from the East India Company, for example. You know, instead smuggle. Imagine. So they were actually suggesting to people that if you were a patriot, that you should smuggle and don't buy anything from the British. Smuggle sugar, smuggle tea. In other words, buy it from a French or Dutch or Portuguese company, etc. But don't buy it from the British. Be a patriot. So again, those were, you know, boycotts. You know, they were boycotting the English trade. In other words, you have to trade outside of the British system. This is patriotic, they will say. Okay, it was not all that successful because ultimately, what historians have told us in research is that people were at this point so accustomed to tea and sugar that they will simply buy it from the British if there was no other option, in other words. So, you know, the colonists are simply going to consume the product, nonetheless, but the merchants are trying to affect the British trade and then telling people not to buy, again, from the British companies, okay? So it was not that successful because colonists will simply continue to buy products anyways, you know, at the marketplace, at any rate, okay? So number three, again, the resistance actions are going to escalate much, much further. And they're going to become quite violent. Okay? And the reason for that is because the masses, particularly farmers, again, in Massachusetts, are going to be very, very, very radicalized, okay, by the ideas, by the political commentaries of the merchants of the Sons of Liberty, and they're going to start now unleashing their anger, if you will, against British officials, okay? So when they saw, for example, a British tax collector, okay, a custom official in the port of Boston, etc. There's British officials, they're going to be harassed. Again, there's going to be harassment. In other words, there will be large mobs that were called. A mob was just simply a group of people that are angry. They carry pitchforks in many cases, and they harass those officials because they're angry at them, because they're collecting taxes, they're taxing the trade. So they identify those officials as the source of their frustrations. If they have any frustrations back then, of course, the lack of opportunities, the lack of land, etc. They're going to unleash, of course, their frustrations on the British. And in one occasion, actually, this got so much out of hand that one mob actually went to the governor's house, Thomas Hutchinson, and actually burned the house of the governor. Okay, because the governor, Thomas Hutchinson, was pro-British. He was pro the loss of trade. He was endorsing the Navigation Acts quite, publicly and openly. And he gave a speech supporting, again, those laws of trade, saying there's no issue with that, again, that we should pay those taxes, we should comply. And of course, that got, again, the colonists extremely, extremely angry. And they're going to go to his house, of course, and trash it and burn it, of course. So again, the resistance is not just passive anymore. We see that there's already, again, violence building up gradually, and British officials feel very uneasy in Massachusetts. I mean, if you were sent by Parliament on a mission, again, you're commissioned to go and supervise a port or collect taxes, etc. People look at you, very angry, and this is a very hostile, society towards the British. They're not welcoming you. In other words, they're harassing you, etc. So even the governor, of course, had to call. He had actually to call for help. He sent, of course, a delegation to Great Britain to request protection, that is to say, because, again, the lives, the integrity, again, the physical integrity of government officials was at stake now. So, of course, Great Britain had to send aid, and they're going to send about 4,000 troops to Boston, to protect, physically to protect, again, the officials there, the governor, to protect the tax collectors and all the others, of course. So now we're going to see a growing presence, again, of troops in Massachusetts, because Massachusetts is now becoming more and more radicalized, if you will. The colonists are now becoming more and more anti-British, and they're now harassing the officials, etc. So there's now the physical presence of British troops arriving. Okay, this is going to actually lead to yet another confrontation between the crowds, what they were referred as the mobs in this case, and the British troops now. Again, this happened on March the 5th of 1770. And that was when a few British soldiers, again, were simply walking around, again, the port of Boston, again. It was an ordinary day, if you will, but suddenly, again, there was a crowd assembled, and they're going to approach the soldiers, and again, they were very mad. You look at their faces, and they're very angry. You just arrived again from Great Britain quite recently to this place, and you see that the society is not welcoming you. In fact, they're actually harassing you. They're coming after you, and of course, and in order to disperse the crowd, they just again open fire, and there was an individual again that got shot again there. Okay. Again, it was again out of fear, if you will. The British soldiers just opened fire, of course, to disperse the crowd. It was a large crowd, and more than likely the crowd meant to actually maybe lynch mob, you know, the soldiers. It was again very confusing. So the soldiers, out of fear, perhaps again just opened fire and ended up wounding or killing again an individual there. This became known as the Boston Massacre. Again, so was it really a massacre? It was not necessarily a massacre. It was, again, an incident, if you will, that ended up with a person losing his life. But again, from the perspective of the colonists, again, this was not just an incident. They interpret this as a massacre, in other words. Okay, so this served also to increase the tensions, the climate of tensions with the British. Massachusetts is just, again, you know, in a boiling point, Massachusetts colony. And in 1773, there will be yet another resistance action of resistance that the Sons of Liberty carried out in order to resist a new Navigation Act that the British Parliament had just recently passed, and that is in the year 1773. That Navigation Act, okay, was called the Tea Act of 1773. Okay, British Parliament in 1773 passed the Tea Act. It's a new Navigation Act. Okay, and what this act indicated is that the British East India Company was now to control and dominate all the tea trade in North America. Not only importing the tea. In other words, it's not just a matter that, well, you have to buy the tea from the East India Company, but rather that the only ones that will be able to sell the tea is going to be the British East India Company. So once again, it's not just, you know, you have to buy it from this company, then you can sell it yourself, but rather, you know, no one will be able to sell the tea except British East India Company. And you know, this is something I actually, of course, indicated in session 2, is that one of the reasons why British Parliament is passing those Navigation Acts is because the East India Company was really facing a lot of financial difficulties because they had imported just so much black tea from India that was sitting in warehouses in London, tons and tons and tons of black tea, that if they did not sell it, this tea was going to go to waste. And again, the East India Company will lose enormous resources there, of course. And in order to kind of help the company, okay, get back in track, you know, they needed to sell this tea, and they turned around and said, look, the colonies is a great market. The 13 colonies of North America, there's a great demand of this tea. So the Tea Act meant to grant the East India Company now to not just import the tea, but to sell it as well. Again, they actually licensed like 5 individuals. Okay, the East India Company actually awarded licenses to 5 individuals from within the company to be the only licensed merchants of tea in the colonies. So this is going to totally displace the colonial merchants. They're not going to be selling tea anymore, in other words, because they're not licensed. And furthermore, the East India Company under the Tea Act was going to bring tea and actually sell it very cheaply. Okay, very cheap. So there's no way, again, the colonial merchants can compete anyways with the prices that are now going to, East India Company is going to introduce, because they're going to actually lower the price significantly to the point that even if they smuggle the tea, even if merchants from Boston, etc., smuggle the tea, they're not going to compete with the East India Company, because the East India Company is going to sell the tea very cheaply. It's not going to be a business for them, in other words. Okay, so as a matter of fact, this is again lowering the price of tea from the perspective of the consumer. Again, in the colonies, they're going to buy now tea very cheaply if you're just simply a consumer. But if you are the merchant, if you're the seller, again, you're out of business, in other words. Okay, so therefore, again, those tea merchants, again, in the colonies, from Boston, from New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, South Carolina, are going to get together, and they try to organize a resistance against the Tea Act that was far more successful in Boston. And what the resistance implied is that as the British East India Company was sending 7 ships full of black tea, one to Philadelphia, another one to Charleston, South Carolina, there were 2 to New York, and 3 ships sent to Boston. The idea is, look, let's close down the port. Let's take a lot of people to the port, close it down, and prevent the ships from actually bringing the cargo inland, in other words, into the main harbor. So again, pretty much blockading, in other words, those ports to prevent the East India Company from actually bringing the tea down in the colonies. So it was far more successful in Boston, because it is here that, again, there were 3 ships actually now that approached the port, and the Sons of Liberty are going to take a lot of people there. Hundreds of people, and camp out actually day in, day out in the port, and the captains of the ships are not allowed to bring the cargo in. Okay, the black tea. They, they couldn't turn back, because they said, we have orders, we have to bring the tea. And, the Sons of Liberty, of course, the tea merchants are just insisting that, they're not going to allow it. So one night, the Sons of Liberty decided to put an end to this situation by actually dressing as Mohawk Indians. They're going to dress as Mohawk Indians. Those are the indigenous groups of New York, by the way. And dressing as Mohawk Indians, and actually going into the ship in the middle of the night, and actually dumping all of this tea into the ocean. Okay, 90,000 pounds of tea was just completely wasted. The colonists actually are now affecting the largest company, the largest British company, again, affecting their interests directly again. So this is not a minor situation, a minor incident. This is major, because they're actually affecting, again, the commercial interest of the British East India Company. Okay, because they felt that they were going to be displaced again out of this trade. So from their perspective, they were carrying out this action in order to pretty much affect again the tea trade of this company, and send a message that they were not going to actually dominate this trade, in other words. Okay, so this is a painting, okay, of the Sons of Liberty dressed as Mohawk Indians and dumping all of this black tea into the sea, and they call this the Boston Tea Party. Okay, because according to the tea culture, of Massachusetts, but also, this is part of English culture, the tea culture of England. Tea parties was precisely that: people getting together, drinking a lot of tea, getting really hyper, and so on, and actually partying, in other words. And so they saw this as a party, if you will, the Boston Tea Party. It was actually a revolt against lower taxes, as a matter of fact. So in actuality, they were revolting against lower taxes because tea was going to be so cheap that it was not going to be profitable again for the merchants. So that's exactly what it was. So once again, those are just paintings, representations of the party itself, the so-called Boston Tea Party. Again, it is really one economic group, the colonial tea merchants, revolting against another economic group, again, the East India Company from London, of course. But again, the British are going to respond more decisively here against Massachusetts. They're going to respond even more decisively than before. Members of Parliament see that Massachusetts had taken, again, the resistance way too far. They were, of course, boycotting, the English trade, actually telling people to smuggle, for example, okay, pamphleteering revolutionary ideas, harassing, public officials, British officials, tax collectors, which really, in many cases, it was not just the harassment itself, it was actually a very humiliating form of harassment in which many custom officials or tax collectors were actually seized by the crowd, by the mob, and they were so-called tarred and feathered. In other words, they were removed, all their clothes were removed, they put tar on their bodies and put feathers again. It was a very humiliating act, to put them down, to humiliate them, but it was actually also very painful as well. Okay, it was very painful to be tarred and feathered as well. And they burned the house of the governor, again, Thomas Hutchinson, as well. And now the British, again, the East India Company, again, has lost 90,000 pounds of tea, the famous Boston Tea Party. And so members of Parliament simply had enough. In other words, they said, well, this is enough, so now we have to act more decisively. And they passed a series of acts targeting Massachusetts, to punish Massachusetts, in other words, to discipline Massachusetts colony. They were called the Coercive Acts. The Coercive Acts of 1773, and there were some others that were passed in 1774, 1775, for about 2 years. British Parliament was passing a series of acts against Massachusetts, and the people of Massachusetts, the colonists, called them the intolerable acts. They were unbearable, in other words. They were just so harsh, in other words. And once again, this targeted Massachusetts colony, okay? This is not to say that the other colonies are not going to be affected, but what the British are doing is making an example, again, is that what will happen to Massachusetts can potentially happen to the other colonies if the other colonies, behave in the similar manner, like Massachusetts. So I'm not going to, there's so many, again, of those pieces of legislation, just the most important ones, again, that are going to be more significant for the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. And that is the coercive acts that are more important here. The most important is what is called the Massachusetts Government Act. Okay, the Massachusetts Government Act. So, what is the Massachusetts Government Act? Well, the Massachusetts Government Act pretty much changed the status of Massachusetts Colony from being a private company. Remember, this is something we covered already in the second topic of the semester, looking at early colonization, how the British established a series of trading companies in North America. They were owned by private merchants, private investors. They were called joint stock companies. So Massachusetts colony was actually a company. It was called Massachusetts Bay Company, actually, owned by a series of investors and stockholders from London, particularly from Plymouth as well. And so that charter, the charter that Massachusetts Bay Company obtained from Parliament and from the King was Revolts. Okay, and instead of now Massachusetts being owned by a private, company, now this company is now owned by the King. It had become now a royal company, that is to say. So from being a privately owned company itself, now this company is owned by the King. Royal, it's a royal charter. Okay, it's owned by the King. So what that means is that if you own land in Massachusetts, if you own land, if you're a farmer, for example, if you're a merchant, you happen to own also large tracts of land there, you have businesses, there's cattle ranchers, of course, as well, and so on. Again, there's different enterprises, of course. What that means is that that property that you think that is yours has become the King's property. Okay, is the King. So going back to the English Civil War, if you're a landowner, if you own property in Massachusetts, well, that entitlement, that right to that property can be totally revoked by the King if you behave in the wrong manner. In other words, if you're not loyal, that is to say, because that property is now the entitlement of the King of England. Okay, so because this is now the King's company or colony, now the King is going to make all the appointments in the political system. All political appointments, from the governor all the way to the towns and the councils, the city councils, all of the political administrators, they're not going to be elected anymore by the colonists the way they were in the past. Of course, the governor was not elected by the people. He was appointed by the King or Parliament, of course. But all the city councils, again, people serving in the councils of every city, were actually chosen by the population. So all of that system of political representation comes to an end in Massachusetts, because now the King is sending all the officials, and from the governor all the way to the towns again, to govern the colony on his behalf, and they're very loyal to the King, not to the colonies, of course. So again, so it is really affecting the private property, interests. The institution of private property has become now, vulnerable to the King's decision to simply seize the property, if you will, of certain individuals, again, like the Sons of Liberty, for example. Okay, and also the political representation is that, again, this self-rule, the self-governance, it's called autonomy, is also at stake, because now the colonies are not going to have a say as to who they're going, again, who's going to govern them. And of course, the port of Boston was closed as well, so Boston cannot trade now with the outside, because what the coercive acts did was that Massachusetts is not going to trade anymore. They're not going to export any products or import any products until Massachusetts pay the East India Company for all the tea that they destroyed. Okay, they have to pay the company in order for them to reopen their trade. Okay, so again, this really affected, once again, the merchants, the producers who were making monies, again, from their exports, etc. They're not going to be exporting anything. So this is going to lead now to the Declaration of Independence very soon in 1776. So this is, again, something that is going to join, if you will, the coercive acts. Again, what was happening in Massachusetts, this is going to bring together, okay, all of the merchants from all the 13 colonies and also the plantation owners they're going to now come together. So this is the most important economic group, again, the dominant, if you will, economic or social class, again, of the colonies, because they fear that what happened to Massachusetts can indeed happen to all of the other colonies as well, that those colonies can simply become now royal charters, and that their property domains, if you're a plantation owner, well, your plantation owner can be seized, if you're not loyal, of course. And they're not able to trade, anymore freely and so on. So, again, so this is going to bring all of those prominent individuals from all the colonies that were engaged in commerce, that own land and enterprises, because they're very concerned about, again, Massachusetts. And they're going to now create their first system of representation. They're actually going to go ahead and actually create a forum, if you will, a Congress, in other words. Let's create a Congress to represent the interests, the concerns of the colonists, in other words. So this is not, again, going to be connected to British Parliament. Now the colonies are going to create their own system of representation, their own government, in other words. This was known as the First Continental Congress. In 1774, now delegates from each of the colonies are going to now come together and meet in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They chose Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to be the seat, again, of this new emerging governmental structure that is totally controlled and represented by the colonists now, by themselves, in other words. So the idea is we have to meet here in order to decide what we're going to do, okay? We all have to agree, let's take a vote, in other words, as to what will be the best course of action. And initially, in 1774, the delegates of this First Continental Congress are not really thinking about independence, although some of them are, okay, thinking about independence, but they're not really voicing those opinions that openly, okay. Initially, what they're going to do is send letters to the king. In other words, King George III is now going to receive hundreds of letters, again, from the delegates of the First Continental Congress, not to declare independence, but rather to protest. Those were letters of protest, that is to say, we're hereby protesting, we want you to intervene in this case, and talk to Parliament, negotiate a deal to reopen the port, and we just want to ease tensions. In other words, at this point, they don't want independence. What they want is simply to solve the problem, in other words, to reach a compromise. So they're appealing to the king, in other words, to King George III. But as this Continental Congress is holding meetings, they receive news that in Massachusetts there's already fighting going on, okay? That the British troops are already clashing with rebels in two towns, in Concord and Lexington, in Massachusetts. There's already fighting going on. So again, Massachusetts is already, in a boiling point already. Okay, this is not just minor incidents or violence, but rather there's already fighting. Okay, actual fighting. There's clashes, there's battles taking place in Concord and Lexington, but still, in 1775, the vast majority of the delegates were loyalists. In other words, 70%. Again, of those delegates said, no, this is not, the time for declaring independence. We don't feel that the time has come to do that, because we still believe that we should be tied to the British. We should be connected to Great Britain. We should be part of it, of the British system. This is the best for us, in other words. And 30% of the delegates were revolutionaries. They wanted, independence. In many cases, they began to voice their ideas quite openly, even though, that was treasonous, of course, to do so. are called as revolutionaries. Again, so this was the ratio. Again, 70% loyalists, 30% still, again, moving towards independence. But that ratio is going to totally flip-flop, in 1775 with the publication of a pamphlet which historians credit to be the spark of independence. The publication of a pamphlet, 60 pages in length, again, written by Thomas Paine. He titled this pamphlet Common Sense. Common Sense was and is still considered even today as to be the main pamphlet that convinced the colonists that independence was the way to go, that it was common sense that the colonies will gain, more from independence than staying tied to the British system, that is to say. Okay, so Thomas Paine, of course, he's British. He was actually a British immigrant that just had recently arrived to the colonies. He's in Pennsylvania, and he's really going to be sympathetic to the cause of the colonies in this case. So he's going to actually side with the colonies in this particular struggle. He's against the Navigation Acts. He's for reforms, providing the colonies with political representation and the like. But at this point, by 1775, Thomas Paine doesn't believe that staying in the British system is what the colonies actually require. He actually believes that independence is what the colonies needed. In other words, if the colonies were to actually prosper and benefit, of course, economically, culturally, etc. And he's going to actually be commissioned by Benjamin Franklin, to actually write this piece. He was a gifted writer. He was a philosopher, intellectual, who had the gift of the written word. He could write in very simple language, using simple terms, to convince the general population of, the cause for independence, that this is what we need, in other words. So he titled it Common Sense because what he's actually appealing here with his ideas is he's appealing to the common sense part of us, in other words. That, look, I'm going to actually, describe a series of ideas here that will explain to you in simple language why it's common sense that independence is going to benefit you. The colonies will benefit from independence because what he actually saying here, again, 60 pages, of course, is that the colonies will benefit from independence because the colonies are in North America and they're sitting in a land that is abundant with natural resources. That, look, you are blessed, to be in a region, again, of this continent that have unlimited resources, whether you're talking about land for farming, for example. Of course, there's a lot of natural resources. There are mineral resources. You got timber, for example. You got very fertile soil for agriculture. You got plenty of rivers that you can use to water your plantations, or water your farms, etc., for cattle ranching, etc. You can actually become the breadbasket of the world because you just have so much land, again, at your disposal, that it is very rich with minerals, with water, with resources at large, that you're going to be rich. If you gain independence, you're going to become one of the wealthiest nations in the face of the earth. So think about it. And of course, you can actually use the land to industrialize as well. You can build industries as well, manufacturing and the like. So you, by independence, you can become one of the wealthiest nations in the face of the world, in the face of this planet. So that was very convincing. He's going to spend, a lot of time writing about that, elaborating upon it. And of course, he's also going to appeal to this common sense, notion of, well, what will you gain from independence? Land and free trade. Now, so he's really speaking to two important groups: the landless colonists that want to move westward, but they can't because the British are there, the Ohio Valley, for example, and the colonial merchants and planters that want also to trade freely with the rest of the world, but they can't because of the Navigation Acts. So he's actually talking to two groups. Look, if you want land in the West because you don't have any, or you want to engage in free trade, but you can't, well, independence is the solution. In other words, it's common sense. In other words. And so number three, there's another argument he's going to use is, look, it's not a matter whether you should actually declare independence or not, because the revolution had already begun. There's already fighting taking place, okay, in Concord and Lexington. There's people fighting already. So the war is already underway. So it's not a matter whether should we start fighting or not, because the struggle already began, of course. And so because it was widely read by the delegates of the First Continental Congress, and of course they inform people in the colonies about those ideas of Thomas Paine, this pamphlet is going to spark now, the Declaration of Independence, because now there's going to be public opinion is going to turn in favor of independence. Now 70% of the delegates and 70% of the colonists are going to now favor independence, and only 30% will remain loyal. Okay, so pretty much flip-flop, the ratio. So in 1776, the delegates are going to now meet again. There's going to be a second Continental Congress, a second Congress, a second assembly. That the purpose for this meeting, the delegates drawn from the 13 colonies are going to meet there. It was to actually write a document to be sent to the British Parliament. A sort of exit. Okay, they wanted to exit the British system. Okay, they don't want to be part of the British system anymore. And so they're going to actually declare independence from this system. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson was actually commissioned to write the document, the Declaration of Independence, in 1776. And he's going to use English history and English philosophy, political philosophy, to explain it to the British people that this is just. In other words, what we're actually saying here in this document is something that you can actually relate to because you understand. You already went through this in your own history. So we're simply going to validate our actions by appealing to something that you already know. And this is part of your tradition, in other words. So they're going to blame the British king for all colonial ills, because this is what in the English Civil War, again, of the 1640s, Parliament was actually fighting for, the merchants, that is, again, blaming the British king for all of the colonial ills. Indicating that the merchants, the property owners of the colonies, and the colonists as a whole, their rights have been violated. In other words, the violation of natural rights. Okay, life, liberty, and property. In other words, look, we hereby state that we do have rights, life, liberty, and property, and those rights have been violated, systematically with the Navigation Acts, starting with the Navigation Acts, but also with the Coercive Acts of Massachusetts as well. Okay, so that justify the exit. In other words, that justify the revolution. We want to change the system. We want to withdraw from the system because we want to create a new one. We want to create a new one that actually provides representation and a system that actually honors the natural rights, again, of the population, of life, liberty, and property. So the Declaration of Independence was nothing other than a document that is going to provide a list of grievances, complaints and grievances based on the idea of life, liberty, and property, natural rights, and the lack of political representation in order to justify revolution. In other words, that's exactly, again, what this document intended to do. Okay, it's a list of grievances. And again, I'm not going to list all of them. The most important ones, again, listed in the Declaration of Independence is cutting off trade. Okay, we have been cut off of trade with the Navigation Acts and all the laws that I explained deprived us from participating in trade. It affected, in other words, our interest, our property. That is to say, impose taxation without representation, without consent, the consent of the government, of the governed. Again, that the idea that people need to consent, need to take a vote, need to voice their opinion, need to validate, taxes. There's no real representation. We're not taking a vote. We don't have no say, in other words, in those laws. Abolish colonial assemblies and governments in Massachusetts. Remember that all of the city councils, the colonial assemblies, were totally abolished because the king replaced the political structure, with administrators that he actually sent to Massachusetts to replace all the political administrators of that colony, depriving, of course, the population to choose their own representatives to govern their own cities, their own town, their own affairs. Also, there's another complaint is that Great Britain was already impressing colonists into the Royal Navy, because from the perspective of Great Britain, the colonies were English subjects that needed to serve the mother country, and in many cases, many of the colonies were simply forced to serve in the Royal Navy. So thereby being deprived of liberty, in other words. Quartering soldiers as well, there's another complaint that people were required to quarter soldiers as well, and they had no choice to do so, of course. And also, last but not least, is again that the English king was actually hiring also German mercenaries to fight in Massachusetts. So in many cases, the so-called British troops that were in Massachusetts fighting the rebels, in many cases were not even British. Those were actually German, mercenaries that were fighting the colonists as well, the Hazens they were called. So that was considered also another, offense, if you will, of the British Parliament and the King against the colonies that justify, of course, the action towards independence and revolution. Of course, by sending this document, to Parliament, that initiated what is called the American Revolution itself. It spanned between 1776 and 1783. Because there's going to be a struggle. In other words, Great Britain is not going to accept this exit. In other words, this independence. They're going to be, struggling to retain control of the colonies. So therefore, the colonies must also defend their decision, against the British. The British are about to send troops and so on to the colonies, and of course, there's going to be a fight. In other words, so the colonies assemble, okay, a Continental army. In other words, there's going to be now a unified force. Every colony is going to now send volunteers or people that are going to now fight for independence, and they're going to be led by George Washington from Virginia. George Washington is going to be the commander, if you will, the general of the Continental Army that is going to now confront the British during this process. So the colonies felt that they were trained. In fact, again, this is something I already mentioned to you. The French and Indian War. During the French and Indian War, the colonists fought on the side of the British. So the colonists felt that they could indeed fight the British because they understood British strategies, British formations, and etc. So they were trained. They acquired military skills by the British. Now they're going to use them against the British, of course. Great Britain is going to rely on the assistance of Native Americans in this case. It is true, Great Britain is going to send a lot of troops to the colonies to fight the colonists, the rebels in this case, but Also, just like France, before in the French and Indian War, rely on the assistance of the Native Americans. Likewise, Great Britain is going to reach out to the natives. A lot of indigenous groups are going to be recruited by the British to fight the colonists. And so there's going to be a British-Indian alliance again. And also at the same time, the British also recruited African slaves. Okay, in the southern colonies, the British are going to go to the plantations and they're going to free thousands of slaves with the promise that if the slaves fought on the side of the British were simply going to grant them freedom. They were going to liberate them, in other words. So this actually was another, episode of the Revolutionary War, that there will be also thousands and thousands of slaves that were liberated from the southern plantations by the British forces and recruited into the British ranks to fight, again, the colonists as well. Okay, so again, this is going to be a strategy that the British implemented in this war. Okay, so likewise, the colonists are going to find out that they cannot really win independence by themselves. In other words, like, they're confronting, of course, a very powerful European empire, the British Empire, of course. So they're not going to, succeed by their own effort. They need the assistance of European powers. And who else than the rivals of Great Britain, those that Great Britain displaced from North America, that are still resentful of that fact. France and Holland. So Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania will be sent to France and to Holland in order to secure an alliance assistance, in other words, from France and Holland. Again, because the colonists needed financial aid and also war supplies, okay, like gunpowder, etc. In fact, 90% of the gunpowder that the colonists, George Washington, the Continental Army actually used during this war came from France, okay, from France. And of course, France and Holland were so willing to help the colonies gain independence because, from their perspective, if the colonies will gain independence from Great Britain, well, on one hand, that they will consider that to be retribution, vengeance against the British. But on the other hand, that will entail also the possibility of resuming trade with in North America. That Great Britain is not going to be the only European power now trading in North America, because now the colonies are going to become independent, and as independent now states, they're going to also open relations, more openly, more freely, if you will, more legally, with France and Holland as well. They want to trade in North America as well, in a more legal way, not legal fashion, that is to say. So far, they're smuggling, of course, materials, but now they want, of course, independence in North America. There's something to gain commercially, that is to say. Okay, so the Dutch actually financed the entire war effort, the independence war effort as well. France provided war materials, etc. But the Dutch are going to finance, of course, the struggle. Okay, so now the situation is totally reversed for the British. The British found now that her rivals in Europe are helping the colonies, and that Britain is going to now deal with the burden, if you will, of sending troops, and it's going to be a very costly war. It's not just the colonies you're fighting, you're also fighting the European powers that are assisting the colonies as well. So the colonies are going to gain a lot of strength, again, monetarily, because they're being financed now by the Dutch. And so this is going to be a long struggle. Great Britain is going to eventually lose ground, just like France lost ground during the French and Indian War and had to let go of North America. Again, because it was so costly, it was so long, again, the war. It took a toll on their finances. Likewise, Great Britain will have to let go of the colonies as well. So this was a situation that was so reversed. The French and Indian War, that situation is now, applied to Great Britain. Great Britain, again, is going to reconsider fighting North America because they're fighting in Europe as well. Great Britain is fighting in certain conflicts in Europe. We don't have the time to go into those conflicts here, but Great Britain has to prioritize. The priority is Europe, in other words. I'm actually fighting, a war 3,000 miles away. I have to send supplies and troops and, food and so on to keep the war going, and this is going to, again, be very costly. So why not just, spend those resources in Europe itself? So Great Britain was forced to let those colonies go as a result of that. And of course, another issue that convinced the British leaders to let those colonies go is the fact that a great portion of the population of those 13 colonies are non-loyal British colonists. Okay, so the vast majority of them, again, are Irish, Scottish, and German. The vast majority are German, by the way. So the bulk, again, of the non-British colonists are actually German. Okay, it is considered about 50%, again, of the colonists that living in North America, British colonists, again, are not British. They're actually German immigrants, again, and the Scottish and the Irish. And it was very well known that they had no sympathy. Again, particularly the Irish, in this case, they have no sympathy towards Great Britain. They're not loyal because they're not British, and they have certain issues, of course. Going back in Europe, of course, they have, tensions, of course, that they're not necessarily friends, in other words. So it's going to be very hard to win this war when half of the population or more don't feel any connection, again, to the mother country, because of their ethnic backgrounds, etc., previous conflicts in Europe, and so on, again, rivalries and the like. So again, finally, again, now part 3 is going to be so quick. So again, this is pretty much looking at the outcome itself. By 1783, Great Britain had to let those colonies go. Okay, it's going to recognize the independence of the 13 colonies in a treaty that they signed in Paris, in France itself, the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Again, this is the triumph of the independence revolution. Finally, Great Britain acknowledges the independence of the colonies in this treaty. Okay, and those colonies become now independent states, and they're going to join, of course, create a union, if you will, of states, the 13, again, United States of North America. And this is a name that it was just, coined, rather improvised, in an improvised manner, but it's going to actually stay, it's going to stick, in a certain sense. And this is how the country is going to be known for and named, the United States of North America. 13 independent states are coming together to form a union. Okay, and the Treaty of Paris also attempted to establish some boundaries between British Canada and the United States. In other words, Canada is still British, it's a colony. And so there were maps that were drawn, during this time that attempted to draw the borders. Of course, this is going to be problematic, as we'll see, because those borders were not very clear, and there's going to be a lot of territorial disputes, by the way. And there's going to be a second conflict with Great Britain in 1812, the War of 1812, conflicts that also dealt with Canada itself, of course. But again, the treaty attempted to outline the boundaries. 250,000 colonists left the United States because they were loyal to Great Britain. They were loyalists. Okay? They remained loyal throughout the struggle. So they left either to British Canada or left to Britain, or they went to Jamaica, the colony, the British colony of Jamaica in the Caribbean. Okay, so that's another thing, again, that the outcome of the independence revolution. And last but not least is that likewise there will be great loss of Southern slaves. Another outcome of the independence revolution is that the British freed thousands of slaves, okay, because they were promised freedom again, and they fought on the side of the British, and Southern planters just lost so many of them, okay. And this is going to create a grievance, okay, among the planter class in the South, that for many, many years, okay, they insisted that the British had to compensate for the loss of property. They will constantly write letters, and there will be petitions by the Southern planters again that they wanted compensation. So this is going to be the first wave of emancipation again of African slaves. The British were the first ones to initiate the emancipation of the African slaves, something that, of course, that is not going to be a complete process. Again, slavery will continue to exist and expand in the American South, of course, for many years to come. But Great Britain, of course, you know, kind of initiated this process again in the South, if you will. Okay, so this is the end of this topic. The questions are written at the very bottom of the outlines. They're already posted on Blackboard. But again, this is the end. Again, this is the end of Session 3, dealing with the American Revolution. We have concluded this topic, and so after this, we're actually going to be moving into the national period. Okay, the last 3 topics of the semester are going to deal with the national period, something I will announce again in the 7th topic of the semester, again, that is coming next after this. That's all I have for you, and that's all, again, regarding this topic on the American Revolution. Thank you.